Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Dr. Arparma from IIT Kanpur, and this is the week 7 of the course. We are going to talk about the language in human brain. Now, one might ask very few simple questions about languages in or the representation of language in the brain. Say, for example, how does the brain handle spoken, signed, and written inputs to derive the meaning of the words? Also, for example, how does the brain communicate by meaning by being able to produce the three different modalities of language? A central concept that has been useful in understanding the representation of language in the human brain is that of the mental lexicon. Mental lexicon can be thought of as a store of information in the brain, or a mental store of information in the brain that includes information about words that we know of. It includes semantic information, that is information related to the meaning of the words. It includes syntactic information that include basically about what are the different forms of the word possible, past tense, present tense, future, continuous tense, and so on. Also, it includes detailed information about word forms. Depending on the modality, it could include, say, for example, if you think of a mental lexicon that includes, word form information both in terms of sounds and scripts, then it will have visual form information as well, and it will have auditory form information as well. Now, this is where several theories of language basically have argued that the mental lexicon plays a very important role in language processing. Some theories argue for a single mental lexicon for both language comprehension and production, while some theories have argued for separate mental lexica for language comprehension and production. Okay, so again, there is a little bit of a debate about this. Now, overall, the basic concept of the mental lexicon is that you can think of it as a store of information about words that, let us say, exist in the brain. Now, the first step in understanding words is to be able to analyze them perceptually depending upon the modality, such as whether the word is listened to or it is read. Now, once this initial perceptual processing is done, there are three general processes that are hypothesized to begin. Lexical access. Now, it refers to the stage of processing in which the output of the perceptual analysis, whether it is visual output or auditory output, is supposed to activate the word form representations in the mental lexicon. Remember, I said in the mental lexicon there can be visual forms of the word stored as well and auditory forms of the word stored as well. Now, basically, what output has come in, say for example, on the basis of the input, whether you are reading the word, then it will be a visual input. Whether you are listening to the word, then it will be an auditory input. This visual or auditory input of the word form, how does the word sound like, or how does the word look like, will be matched to the representation, same kind of representation from the mental lexicon. See, how do we remember words? We remember them as sounds. We obviously also remember them as spellings. So the visual form. So basically, lexical access is accessing the word form information from the mental lexicon of the word, irrespective of the modality, whether it is a visual modality or auditory modality. The second is, as soon as you start, you arrive at you are performing this process of lexical access. Not only the best match of the visual input or the auditory input that you're getting is getting activated. Some partial matches, some semantically related, phonologically related candidates will also get activated. The process of lexical selection is required then. Basically, it involves the selection of the best match of the input, irrespective of the various lexical alternatives that may have been activated. Now, lexical integration refers to the process of integrating words into full sentences. Once you have sort of reached the word and you selected the word, then you have to integrate this word to the representation of the entire sentence. Remember, let us say let's take an example of a sentence like, I planted the old man planted a tree across the bank. Once you hear the word bank and you have activated the lexical form, etc., you have to match it with whether it is, it is basically congruent with the entire sentence or not. So lexical integration is needed, basically, which means that integrating of words into fuller sentences and then the sentences into discourses and into larger context. basically completing the process of comprehension of language, because unless you integrate the word with the sentence and the sentence with the overall narrative, you are not going to be able to comprehend any language. Now, grammar or syntax are the rules which the words or the lexical items using which the words or the lexical items are organized in a particular language to produce the intended meaning. Now, let's consider the mental lexicon in some more detail. Now, a typical individual has knowledge of about some 50,000 words and can easily recognize and produce up to 3 words per second. It seems, therefore, that the mental lexicon must have been organized in a very efficient manner, because even though you have 50,000 entries, let us say, in your mental lexicon, you can almost without fail automatically and very quickly access whatever words that you want to speak, even let us say in an impromptu conversation. Now, so this basically tells us that this organization of the mental lexicon must be really, efficient. Let us look at some of the organizational principles of the mental lexicon. For instance, one of the representational units in the mental lexicon is the morpheme. The morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in a language. Basically, there are two kinds of morphemes. Words, once you start reading words, you start analyzing words, you can analyze the words into morphemes. I'll give you an example. The word player is composed of two morphemes. One is play and the other is er. Play is can be considered to be an isolated or say for example a standalone word that has its own meaning, and therefore it can be referred to as a lexical morpheme. On the other hand, the word er is plainly a suffix and basically is used for grammatical purposes. Standing alone, it does not have its own meaning, and therefore it will always have to exist along with another word. So, is basically referred to as a bound morpheme or a grammatical morpheme. Similarly, you can analyze different words as consisting of a number of free morphemes and bound morphemes. So, basically, one of the organizational principles in the mental lexicon is basically as per, as by the virtue of morphemes. How many morphemes does a word contain? A word like play contains a single morpheme, and a word like player or played or playful contains more than one morpheme. Another organizational principle of the mental lexicon is that the words in the mental lexicon are organized by frequency. Frequency basically means how often do you come across a given word. It is measured in quantities like frequency per million words. Suppose you have heard a lot of words, and let us say at every million words you hear, what is the frequency of the word player? Does it occur 5 times out of a million, 500 times out of a million, or 5,000 times out of a million? That number is the frequency per million of the word. Now, different words in the mental lexicon out of the 50,000 words will have different frequencies. Frequency, therefore, is one of the organizing principles of the mental lexicon, basically indexed in the form that frequent words or words that are more frequent are accessed more quickly, they are recognized more quickly, they are read out aloud more quickly, which tells us that they are probably somewhere at the periphery where they can very quickly be accessed. So, one of the ways of organizing the mental lexicon is via frequency. Another organizational principle in the mental lexicon is that of lexical neighborhood. Basically, neighborhood consists of those words that differ from any single word by only one phoneme or just by one letter and are referred to as belonging to the same neighborhood. Let's say the example of the word cat. Now, the word cat, bat, mat, rat, etc. are just differing from each other by one letter or just by one sound. These will be supposed to be in the same neighborhood. Now, studies have indicated that words have more that so studies have indicated that words that have more neighbors are more easy to activate, and they are recalled more quickly, identified more quickly, as compared to words that have fewer neighbors. Now, just to point out that a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that makes difference to meaning. Say, for example, I was giving the example of the word cat. Cat, you change one phoneme from k to ba, it becomes bat. Meaning is changed. You change one more phoneme from ba to ma, it becomes mat. Another, again, the meaning is changed. So, one single sound that once you change it will alter the meaning of the exact word is referred to as the phoneme. A final organizing principle in the mental lexicon is the semantic relationship between words. different words can have different kinds of semantic relationships. Basically, it has been proposed that the representations in the mental lexicon are organized as per the meaning level relationships. Okay. Now, one of the paradigms that scientists have used in order to investigate and understand the meaning level or the semantic relationship between words is the priming paradigm. Typically, what happens in the priming paradigm is that you take word pairs, one of which both of which are semantically related to each other, but one of the words will be used as a target, whereas another can be used as a prime. In place of the target word, you can also use a different real word or a non-word or a pseudo word. Okay, a pseudo word is basically a word that can be pronounced but does not have any meaning. Now, typically in the priming paradigm, a prime is presented before the target word in context of a lexical decision task. So, lexical decision task is being done wherein you are supposed to answer whether a presented letter string is a meaningful word or not. Now, it has been observed that participants are faster and more accurate at the lexical decision when the target is preceded by a semantically related prime rather than an unrelated prime. Let's take an example. Lexical decision to the word lion shall be faster when lion is preceded by the word cat than when it is preceded by the word house, even though they might be matched at the level of frequency, etc. Now, similar findings are also recorded when participants are asked to read aloud the words presented. Here, naming latencies for target words are found faster if they are preceded by related primes than unrelated primes. So you can see that semantic relationships of words plays a very important role in the organization of words in the mental lexicon. Now, these findings can provide us a clue to the fact that words related to each other in meaning are somehow situated close to each other in the mental lexicon, and also the fact that if one of the words is activated from this neighborhood, other words will also get activated which are semantically similar or share meaning aspects with the target word. Now, let us look at some models of the mental lexicon. Several theories have been proposed to basically, theorize about the representation of the mental lexicon. One of the influential models was proposed by Collins and Loftus in 1975, which was referred to as the semantic networks theory. Now, according to the semantic networks theory, word meanings are represented in a kind of a semantic network where each word is represented as a node and the connections between each of these words are represented as links. The strength of the connection between these different nodes or different words are determined by the kind of semantic relationship or associative relationship that is shared between the given words. For example, the word car and truck are semantically related and they will be probably situated closer to each other in the semantic network because they share other features as well. Whereas the word ship, even though semantically it is similar to the word car in the sense that both are means of transport, the level of similarity between car and ship versus car and truck is very different. Car and truck are much more similar, so they are situated much more closer to each other as opposed to car and ship, which are although have by virtue of function they are both modes of transport, but other features are very different. So even though ship will be attached to the word car, it will be situated much farther off in this semantic network as opposed to the word truck, which will be situated much closer to the word car. Although the semantic network model has been extremely influential in understanding, the basically how words are written, how words are organized, it's basically still a matter under investigation. Also, there are several other models that have also proposed to understand how the conceptual knowledge about words is represented in the brain. For example, some models propose that words co-occur in our language, that words which co-occur in the language may be able to prime each other. Uh, for example, the words fountain and pen are, they are not semantically related to each other, but they occur together a lot of times. Say, for example, a lot of people still use a fountain pen. So whenever the word fountain will be occurred, the word pen will be primed. It will automatically become available for selection. Some others have suggested that concepts are represented more by their semantic features or their semantic properties. So, for example, you can analyze a concept in terms of its features. Say, for example, the word dog can be analyzed in terms of few semantic properties like it is animate, it has fur, it has four legs, it barks, etc. So people can ask questions like, or these models will need to specify, say for example, how the words will get activated from features, or how many features do you actually need to activate the target concept. Say for example, just has fur or just as animate can activate many other words other than the word dog. So you probably need one distinguishing feature, activating which you can directly reach the word dog. Say for example, barks. We know that dogs bark, and as soon as the word barks is presented, we can automatically and very quickly activate the word dog. Okay. Another question that these models will probably need to specify is that which features are necessary and which features are dispensable in order to activate the target concept. As we just saw, the feature bark cannot be dispensed with if you want to activate the concept of the word dog. Let's talk a little bit about the neural substrates of the mental lexicon. Now, researchers can understand the neural basis of the mental lexicon better by observing the deficits in patients' language abilities. Different profiles of neurological problems can lead to deficits in understanding and producing the appropriate meaning or of a word or a concept. For instance, patients suffering with Wernicke's aphasia would sometimes make errors in speech production that are known as semantic paraphasias. The semantic paraphasias, they could use the word horse even though they intended to use the word cow. Now you can see that the word cow and horse might be semantically related because they share features, but the patient is unable to activate the target word. Patients having deep dyslexia can also show similar patterns in reading. They might read the word horse even though the word cow is written. Patients with progressive semantic dementias initially show impairments in the conceptual system, although other mental and language abilities might be preserved. For instance, these patients can understand and reduce the syntactic structure of the sentences. This deficit has been linked with progressive damage to the temporal lobes, mostly in the left hemisphere. However, the superior regions of the temporal lobe involved with hearing and speech were also spared. Patients with semantic dementia have difficulty assigning objects to a semantic category. Also, they often sometimes name a category when asked to give the name of an exemplar. Say, for example, if you ask them to name an animal, they will say horse. Name an they Yeah, if you ask them to if you show them a picture of a horse and ask them to name it, they'll probably not be able to say horse, but they will be able to say animal. On seeing a picture of sparrow, they may not be able to say sparrow, but they probably will say bird. Now, neurological evidence from a variety of disorders basically support the idea of semantic networks because words that have similar meaning may get confused, substituted, or sometimes lumped together to form a single category as predicted by the use of semantic network theory. In 1970s and 80s, Elizabeth Warrington performed several studies with a view to investigate the organization of conceptual knowledge in the human brain. And she had patients with different perceptual disabilities as a result of, and she used patients with perceptual disabilities as a result of unilateral cerebral lesions. Now, Warrington and colleagues found that semantic memory problems of their patients often fell into separate semantic categories. Basically, they proposed that patients either had problems with the reflection of the, with the biological categories or with man-made categories. So they proposed that patients' problems were simply reflections of the types of information stored within with different words in the semantic network. So the idea is that they are not able to activate one specific kind of information rather than one specific kind of word. So they said that whereas biological categories rely more on physical properties or visual features, man-made objects are identified mainly by their functional properties. Say, for example, what is a hammer used for or a scissor used for is a better question to ask than, say, for example, just describing their visual properties. Following studies in patients with category specific semantic deficits, it basically reveals a correspondence between lesion size and the types of semantic deficits observed. For example, patients who have impairment for living things had lesions that included the inferior and medial temporal cortex, located mostly in the anterior parts. The anterior inferotemporal cortex is located close to the areas of the brain that are crucial for visual object perception, and the medial temporal lobe contains important relay projections from the association cortex to the hippocampus, a structure involved in encoding information in the long term memory. Finally, the inferior temporal lobe is also the region for storing the what information about the object recognition, stream, and vision. So here you can see how these different areas can come together to allow us to access information about living things. The lesion information for patients with impairments for just man-made things is less clear simply because there has been less data. However, the left frontal and parietal areas seem to be involved in this kind of semantic deficit. Now, these areas overlap with areas of the brain that are engaged with sensory motor functions, which may be involved in the representation of actions that you typically do with these man-made artifacts, such as tools. What do you do with a hammer? What do you do with a scissor, and so on. Now, correlation between the type of semantic deficit, that is semantic deficit for either man-made things or living things, and the area of the brain that is lesioned are consistent with the hypothesis that proposes that patients' problem are indeed a reflection of the different types of information stored with different words in their semantic network. More specifically, whereas biological categories rely more on physical properties or visual features, the man-made objects are identified mainly by their functional properties, and so areas which are engaged in analyzing these functional properties should be affected when deficits are in identifying man-made properties. This hypothesis proposed by Warrington and colleagues has found it mixed evidence in its support and opposition. For example, Martha Farah and James McClellan uh, proposed a computational model of object recognition that seemed to agree with this hypothesis. On the other hand, research by Alfonso Caramazza has reported findings which challenge Warrington's and colleagues' assumption. More specifically, they actually found that for most of these early studies, the stimuli that were included were not well controlled on linguistic parameters like like frequency of use, familiarity, and also on things like visual complexity and similarity. Karamazov proposed an alternate account according to which a semantic network is organized along the conceptual categories of animate and inanimate, in animacy and inanimacy. He proposed that selective damage in brain damage patients is basically reflects the evolutionarily adapted domain-specific knowledge systems that are subserved by different neural mechanisms. So basically, the idea is that knowledge about living things is stored separately and is taken care of by separate neural areas. Knowledge about man-made categories is stored separately and is taken care of by different neural areas. Neuroimaging studies in normal individuals that investigated semantic representations in more detail actually sort of converge on this kind of idea. Let's take an example. Alex Martin and colleagues in the National Institute of Mental Health conducted fMRI studies combined with PET methodology to investigate the intriguing dissociations in normal individuals of the kind that we have just talked about in brain damaged patients. So what they found was that when participants were reading the names of or answered questions about animals, or even when they were naming picture of animals, the more lateral aspects of the fusiform gyrus and the superior temporal sulcus were activated along with the left medial temporal lobe. On the other hand, when participants identified names of tools, activations were observed in more medial aspects of the fusiform gyrus, the left middle temporal gyrus, and the left premotor area, a region that is also activated by imagining hand movement. So basically, areas that are involved in some kind of motor activities. Now, these findings are consistent with the idea that in the human brain, conceptual representations of living things are made and man made things rely on separable neural circuits engaged in processing of perceptual versus functional features. Further, more recent studies of the representations of conceptual information indicate that there is indeed a network that connects the posterior fusiform gyrus in the inferior temporal lobe to the left anterior temporal lobes. For instance, Tyler and colleagues at the University of Cambridge studied the representation and crossing of concepts of living and non-living things in patients with brain lesions to the anterior temporal lobes and in unimpaired participants using fMRI, EEG, and MEG measures. In some of these studies, participants were typically asked to name pictures of living and non-living things, say for example a dog or a clock. Further, the level at which these objects should be named was varied. So you could either name the object at a more generic level or a more specific level. Say for example, you can say tiger versus knife, or you could say living versus non-living. Now, Tyler and colleagues proposed that naming at the specific level would require retrieval and integration of more detailed semantic information than just at the domain general level when you're just saying living versus non-living. More specifically, naming a picture at a domain general level requires the activation of only a subset of features. So, if something is an animal, it must have legs, fur, eyes, tail, etc. Whereas naming at a specific level requires the integration of additional and more precise features, such as you would need a more detailed idea of the features when you want to distinguish, let us say, a tiger from a panther or a Alsatian from a Doberman, etc. Now, so basically, the idea is that naming something at a more specific level incurs more load. Now, so it may be more difficult to select the features that distinguish. Finally, MEG and EEG studies have demonstrated interesting details about the timing of the activation of conceptual knowledge. More specifically, it showed that the activation of perceptual features occurs in primary cortices within the first 10 milliseconds of the picture being presented. Activations of more detailed semantic representations occur in the more posterior anterior ventral lateral cortex, typically between 150 to 250 milliseconds. And starting around 300 milliseconds, participants are able to name the specific object that is depicted in the picture, which basically required the retrieval and integration of detailed semantic information that is unique to a specific object. So you can see basically the timeline actually says that is probably happening in a more serial manner, and it's also there is a degree of hierarchical processing here. Hierarchical in the sense that first simple features are activated, then only more complicated and semantically detailed features are activated, and once those are activated, only then you can eventually be able to name the words. So this is something that is very important. Okay, so I have talked. I think there's enough for today's lecture. I will move to the next part of language processing in the coming lecture.